General Washington.
Henry, what news do you have for me?
The men are assembled and the boats are ready.
December 1776. The United States is less than 6 months old, and its army is in shambles. The Continental Army has had defeat after defeat and is on the verge of disbanding. The British Army is only a few days' march from the American capital, with Congress scrambling to retreat. As a brutal Ice Age winter sets in, the Continental troops are starved, battered, and freezing to death. General George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, has a daring plan to change the country's fate. A general whose second-in-command would love nothing more than to see him fail must coordinate efforts between factions of a broken army and a band of spies to bring the fight to the enemy's doorstep. In this adventure, we're traveling to Lower Bucks County, where the Continental Army retreated to before turning around and taking the fight to the enemy. There, we're crossing the river alongside a large group of dedicated reenactors, crossing in the same place and using the same method as Washington and his men, before marching the full 9 miles down to Trenton, where the tide turned for the Continental Army. This is the Battle of Trenton on Part-Time Explorer. The drive along the Delaware River, the natural boundary between the states of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, is said to be one of America's top scenic routes. In the summer, it's lush and green. In the fall, the colors are vibrant, and the towns along the river are full of activity and fun. But now, we're looking at it in the winter. It's cold, dreary, and on its worst days, ice can choke up the river. In December, it's hardly the kind of place where you'd want to be camping outdoors, let alone crossing the river in open boats, marching 9 miles south in 4 feet of snow, and engaging in a surprise attack against well-trained German soldiers. And yet, there's one man who decided that that is exactly what he wanted to do. Mr. Dollar Bill himself, George Washington. The place where he crossed the river is preserved by state-run parks on either side, and on the Pennsylvania side is Washington Crossing Historic Park, which keeps the story of the legendary crossing alive with a museum, historical interpreters, and an annual reenactment complete with replica boats and actors portraying the lead historical figures. Visiting the park is an incredible experience. You can feel the significance of what took place here, where the very future of the United States was at stake. The country was still in its infancy, and its existence was defined by nothing but military defeat. It all came down to the gamble that was taken here on this exact riverbank in December 1776. War had been raging between the United States, or as we called it back then, the American colonies, and the British Empire. These colonies belonged to Britain for some time, some as long as 170 years by that point. But as the years went by, the colonies and Britain grew apart. Wars against the French and the Native Americans required taxes to be raised on the colonists, and yet the colonists had no seats in British Parliament or any real say in the government. So the question grew. Why should they be required to pay taxes to a government that they cannot participate in? This is an extreme simplification of things, and there were many factors that ultimately led to hostilities, including violent protests against British troops and British troops opening fire on American civilians. By the 1770s, the relations between the American colonies and Great Britain were a powder keg, and the Americans were arming themselves. Interestingly, Nova Scotia to the north was one of the original American colonies as well, and considered joining the rebellion, but because of its isolation from the rebel leaders and the strong British military presence in Halifax, they remained loyal to the British. In April 1775, British troops were deployed to confiscate and destroy a colonial weapons stash. As they marched towards Concord, Massachusetts, where the weapons were believed to be stored, colonial militia intercepted them, opening fire on the advancing troops. Author Ralph Waldo Emerson described this as the shot heard around the world, and it signaled the outbreak of the American Revolution. A lot was happening at this time, but to simplify, the British sent reinforcements, and the area surrounding Boston became a war zone as the British troops fought American militia. The American colonies did not even have a standard army yet, let alone a governing body. No joke, the guys just got together drinking, and they did not plan this far ahead. Between April and June, 3 different New England colonies, later states, had established a formal army to fight back, but in June, the Continental Congress, or the American government that was in rebellion against the British, passed a resolution to establish a formal American army. Congress voted unanimously to give command of this army to a Virginia-born commander named George Washington. He was a colonel during the French and Indian War a few years prior and had gained tremendous experience in military tactics and strategy. With his appointment to the Continental Army, he was given the rank of general. One of his adjutant generals, or seconds in command, was General Horatio Gates, a former commander in the British Army with extensive experience in combat, especially in battling the Acadians and the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia, and he deeply resented Washington for now outranking him. The Continental Army's first engagement with the British was at Boston. With the British gaining a foothold there, it was now Washington's job to make sure that they did not push inland through Massachusetts. The Continental Army surrounded the British, setting up artillery in the hills above the city and laying siege for several months until the end of 1775, when the British Army evacuated their troops and civilians still loyal to the Crown by ship out of the city and up to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Washington did not know that the British had retreated into Canada and instead thought that the ships were sailing south to New York City in order to land there. So Washington quickly mobilized south to defend that area, first sending General Charles Lee in advance with part of his army, with Washington following shortly afterward. It was now the end of 1775, and the Continental Army signed on each of its soldiers for 1 year. And so from New Year's to New Year's of 1776, the American soldiers were obliged to remain with the army and fight. When the year was up, they were free to go home if they chose not to re-enlist. At the beginning of 1776, with the British retreating out of Boston, the Continental Army believed that this war was going to end well within a year, and there was no need for contracts to last longer than that. Although a second front had opened up in South Carolina as the British tried to capture Charlestown, it was quiet in the northern colonies for the first half of 1776. The British forces were mostly regrouping in Halifax. The Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the summer and released a formal declaration of independence from Britain on July 4, 1776. Until then, they were just in a state of rebellion, but now they declared that they were their own nation, the United States of America, and that they would govern themselves. Of course, the Declaration of Independence is nothing more than fancy words, unless other countries, including Britain, would acknowledge it. And that wasn't going to happen without military victory in this war. A mere month later, in August of 1776, the British returned in full force, this time backed by the Royal Navy, and they landed an offensive in an effort to capture New York City. Reinforcing the British was a detachment of Hessian soldiers. Hessians were soldiers for hire that came from the many territories that now make up modern-day Germany. They were well trained and they were well paid, and now 9,000 of them are fighting alongside the British Army in an effort to end this rebellion. With these troops landing, Washington knew he was in a losing fight, and quietly in the night he withdrew his forces by boat out of Long Island. What followed was a series of demoralizing defeats. The Continentals were defeated at Kip's Bay, at White Plains, at Fort Washington, and at Fort Lee. The Continental Army, which had existed for little more than a year, was made up of hastily trained men, mostly farmers and tradesmen and general laborers, although some did have experience. But they were no match against the British Army, whose incredible training had made them a superpower. New York fell to the British, with Washington pulling his men out of the state and into New Jersey across the Hudson River. The move through New Jersey was a disaster. They were on the run the whole time, pursued by British commander Lord Cornwallis. As the American army had defended different parts of New York City, they split into these different groups to hold different positions. And as they retreated, they ended up going in different directions. At this point, they were still scattered all across New Jersey and New York, but they were moving in the general direction of the Delaware River. One of Washington's generals, General Charles Lee, ended up getting captured by the British, and his body of troops fell even more behind the retreating body of Continental troops. On December 8th, Washington's main force of troops managed to cross the Delaware River out of New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. Stragglers would follow, but his army had dwindled badly. Many of the troops who had not been killed or captured simply deserted, and he was down to approximately 1/10 of the men that he had when he started the New York campaign only a few months prior. Winter was now setting in, and in this era, wars generally paused through the colder months. It was difficult to move around in the winter, and the officers usually exercised the privilege of either going home for the winter or spending that time partying and socializing with the locals. The officers in command of the British Army chose not to pursue Washington into Pennsylvania before the end of the war, and instead to spend the winter in occupied New York City, enjoying Loyalist hospitality. By contrast, what remained of the American army was suffering. Men were still dying, the army lacked proper winter boots or clothes or blankets, and other supplies were hard to come by.
When they get to Pennsylvania, the doctors in Washington's army, the hospital department, are able to go to work and really look at the men for the first time and offer some proper care. 2,000 of the soldiers in Washington's army that reach Pennsylvania are pulled out of the line and sent to temporary hospitals in places like Bethlehem. This is bad. You can't imagine how bad it is.
The majority of the American troops were quartered in the towns scattered around Lower Bucks County, generally in towns within a day's march of the river crossing. Towns like Newtown, Yardley, New Hope, and Morrisville were all temporary homes for the battered army. Today, this place is called Washington Crossing Historic Park, but in 1776, it was the site of McConkey's Ferry, a ferry boat crossing from here in Pennsylvania to the New Jersey side of the Delaware River. And it's the central point of much of the action that we're about to learn about. In the upper parts of Washington Crossing Historic Park is an old stone building known as the Thompson-Neely House. With the extreme suffering of the troops in the aftermath of the terrible battles, as well as the cold setting in, not to mention general lack of hygiene and malnourishment in the camps, this house was turned into an improvised hospital. Only a short walk from the house, in an often overlooked part of the park, is a row of graves. Although there are 23 stones here, it's unknown just how many bodies are buried on this site, or even exactly where those bodies are buried. These represent the soldiers in the Continental Army who died while camped here near McConkey's Ferry in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, either of wounds suffered in battle or the bitter cold. Their bodies were unearthed while construction work was done on the nearby Route 32. Only the stone at the center bears a name, Captain James Moore, a 26-year-old who died of camp fever in the Continental Camp on Christmas Day, 1776. This is a replacement stone marker. His original stone is located in the Park Museum. General Washington himself had set up headquarters 4 miles away from the river in the manor house of William Keith. Here, the weight of the situation that he and his army were in was a heavy burden as 1776 neared the end. His men had been battered and beaten. They had suffered heavy casualties in losing battles across 4 different states. Thousands of them had been killed or captured, but even more had simply abandoned the cause entirely, either swearing allegiance to the king in exchange for a pardon of their treason, or simply laying down their weapons and walking home. Worst yet, as I mentioned before, the soldiers in the Continental Army were enlisted for 1 year at a time. At the end of December, they would be free to go home without being seen as deserters. Congress had hoped that the troops would re-enlist if the war had not yet ended, but why would they, after all that they've lost? Washington had been tasked with defending the new nation and fighting to enforce their emancipation from Britain, but this cause was almost lost. Here they were in Pennsylvania, the birthplace of the nation. Less than 30 miles away was Philadelphia, where Congress convened and declared that independence, but now Congress had abandoned Philadelphia and were retreating south to Baltimore, Maryland. The country, both the army and its government, were broken. Washington himself wrote in a private letter that he believed the game was up, and British commanders were sending word back to the king that victory was within sight. Any unbiased third party looking at the situation would say the war is over. Britain won. Come New Year's Day, the enlistments would expire and the Continental Army would be dissolved. With that, the entire government of the United States would follow along with it. There was no need for a crushing military victory by the British. That had already happened time and time again. Now all the British needed to do was wait out the clock, and they knew that. And so they dined in Manhattan. A handful of small defensive outposts had been set up along the Delaware River, mainly manned by the Hessian troops, in towns such as Bordentown, Cranberry, Brunswick, and Princeton, but most notably, the town of Trenton, 9 miles downriver from McConkey's Ferry. Trenton today is the capital of New Jersey, but it didn't have that status in 1776. It was just a small town then, with a few streets and about 100 buildings or so, including the old barracks. The barracks were built in 1758 during the French and Indian War to house British troops. On December 14th, when 2,500 Hessians moved into Trenton a week and a half before Christmas, it housed some of them. The Hessian forces that moved in were under the command of Karl von Donop. But Donop left town with a portion of his troops to move south to engage a large band of New Jersey resistance fighters. Donop left Trenton to the command of Johann Rall, a loud and obnoxious commander. He was well experienced, but not well respected. Washington saw Trenton as a weak point in the enemy lines. Now, capturing Trenton wouldn't be a militarily strategic victory, but it would feel good. It would give the men something to hold on to and boost their spirits, and perhaps encourage them that the cause wasn't lost, and that it would be worth re-enlisting for 1777. Washington and whatever fragments of his army that he could muster would attack the Hessian regiments at Trenton. But the plan was a wild one. It was to be a three-pronged, coordinated attack. Washington and his men would cross at McConkey's Ferry, not far from where they camped, and march 9 miles south on the New Jersey side, taking the town from the north. General Ewing and his army was to cross the river right at Trenton and capture a bridge on the south side of town. With that bridge in rebel hands, the Hessians would have no way to escape to the south, as they'd be blocked by the Assunpink Creek. General Cadwalader and his army was to cross farther to the south in Bristol, Pennsylvania, and attack the town of Bordentown, New Jersey, creating a diversion and blocking Karl von Donop's troops from returning to Trenton to assist Colonel Rall. Reorganizing a splintered and demoralized army was difficult enough, but that wasn't even the greatest challenge. The trouble was getting thousands of troops and horses and artillery across an ice-packed river in the middle of a freezing night without letting the enemy know. The ferry service's flatboats would be great for getting artillery and horses across, but more boats would be needed to get the masses of men across safely. That's where the Durham boats come in. These boats were cargo boats on the Delaware River that got their name for the Durham Iron Works about 32 miles upstream from McConkey's Ferry. The owner of the ironworks was an ardent supporter of the American cause and produced weapons and ammunition for the army at a financial loss. Washington's use of these boats no doubt thrilled him. They were controlled by rowers and perfect for navigating back and forth across the river. To man them, Washington turned to the 14th Continental Regiment under Colonel Glover. These were Massachusetts boys, and many of them were previously mariners who could handle a boat second nature.
When all the shopkeepers and farmers got to the river, that was a real barrier. None of them took swimming lessons. But we were fishermen from Marblehead, Massachusetts. We traveled over Australia, Caribbean. When we came into camp about 5 days before, we looked at the river and said we could cross, no problem. The 149 of us manned all the boats.
They managed the previous crossing so smoothly in the evacuation of Long Island, and the first time they crossed the Delaware in retreat a few days prior. It's worth noting that the Hunterdon County militia from New Jersey were also instrumental in the handling of the boats. In the days leading up to the assault on Trenton, Continental scout parties attacked several Hessian outposts along the river as a means of testing their strength and gathering information. This, of course, kept the Hessians on alert. They expected an attack on Trenton, and Colonel Rall sent several requests for reinforcements to British command. They were all rejected. But the best insight that Washington got into the Hessian regiments in Trenton was through a spy that Washington had planted in the town. John Honeyman was born in Ireland and served with distinction under the British Army during the French and Indian War. And now, he was one of America's first spies. In Trenton, he posed as a loyalist, conducting business with the British and the Hessian forces, all the while gaining information into their strengths and their positions. But once he had enough information, how does he get this to the Continental soldiers without being seen crossing into their lines? The American Army staged a capture of him, and they dragged him all the way back to Washington's headquarters at the Keith House, where he simply gave him all of the information. Washington, keeping up with the act, ordered that Honeyman be fed, but then imprisoned in the spring house out behind the headquarters. However, a conveniently timed fire nearby gave Honeyman the opportunity to escape back to Trenton. Honeyman raced back into Trenton, all the while keeping up the facade of a devoted loyalist, and he reported to Hessian command that he had been captured, and that he saw the American forces and that they were in so bad of a state that they didn't have the means of attacking Trenton. Colonel Rahl trusted Honeyman so much that they let their guard down. It was almost Christmas anyway, and it was time to relax for the winter. On December 19th, Washington attempted to boost the spirits of his men. A patriotic pamphlet was published in Philadelphia, and copies were brought up to the men for them to read. This was titled The American Crisis by author Thomas Paine.
These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman.
Thomas Paine was with the Army in their retreat across New Jersey, and that gave him the inspiration to put this pamphlet together. He saw their morale dropping, and many of them deserting. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have the consolation that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. On December 20th, 2,600 additional American troops arrive in Pennsylvania, including 600 under General Gates. This brought Washington's forces close to 6,000 men. Washington didn't solidify his plans until December 23rd, when preparations finally commenced.
Behind me is the Jericho Creek, and we're standing just a little bit upstream from where it meets the Delaware River. We're about 2.5 miles upriver from McConkey's Ferry. In 1776, instead of Jericho Creek, it was known as Knowles Creek, and at the mouth was a cove, a larger cove than what there is today. In the day or two leading up to the crossing, about 15 to 18 Durham boats were gathered up and brought to the cove of the Knowles Creek. They were hidden there, out of sight from Loyalist and Hessian lookouts on the far side of the river, so that they wouldn't see that they were being stockpiled.
On Christmas night, from December 25th to the 26th, the crossing was to take place at the 3 different ferry points. But everything was against Washington, including his own officers. General Horatio Gates, Washington's second in command, was gone. He had left the encampment to meet with Congress in order to try and convince them to give him command of the Continental Army, expressing his belief that Washington could no longer lead. No doubt he was also sort of hoping that his absence during such a critical time would result in Washington ultimately failing in this battle and being defeated yet again, and proving Gates's point. Washington's crossing of the Delaware and the Battle of Trenton that followed has been studied by hundreds of historians and written about by many, many different authors. That being said, one very interesting book that I've consulted with on this production is this rare first edition of a book titled 30 Days in New Jersey, 90 Years Ago, published in 1867, while a handful of Revolutionary War veterans were still around. The weather had turned on Christmas Day. As the troops assembled at the ferry crossing, it began to rain and then snow. As the night went on, the storm developed into what is known in these parts as a nor'easter, essentially a snow hurricane. Still, the crossing was to continue. Each soldier was given fresh flints, 60 shots, and food for 3 days.
Henry, I put you in charge of the crossing, yet we're 2 hours late.
General, the march from Newtown has been treacherous. The men have had to stop 2 or 3 times. They have all their equipment with them. They're doing their best.
We're losing the element of surprise. We must keep moving.
We will, sir.
Once back into the Jerseys, we'll have to move quickly.
Colonel Knox, one of Washington's officers, was given command of the crossing operations.
Knox was the guy that he orchestrated this whole thing. and you could hear him talking with this centurion voice through. I mean, there was no speakers or no microphones, no walkie-talkies, no nothing. You had to hear Henry Knox with his booming voice telling you where to go and what to do.
Ever since January 1947, an annual reenactment has taken place right here at the site of the crossing, with hundreds of actors standing guard and then crossing the Delaware in replica Durham boats, sometimes followed by a full-scale march down to Trenton for a mock skirmish in the streets. It's following these reenactments with one of my old cameras way back in 2010, when I was a volunteer here at the park, that we're able to get a sort of visual of what this battle looked like. Of course, bear in mind that as you watch this reenactment footage, you're going to see some anachronisms. There's cars and streetlights in the background. Not every uniform is fully accurate. And of course, there wasn't always snow like there was in 1776. But you know what is accurate? We're doing everything in the same places. We're crossing at the right spot, we're marching the same path, and we're battling down the same streets, doing the same maneuvers to capture Trenton from the Hessians and save America.
Henry, let's proceed to boarding.
Very good, sir.
December 25th, 1776. The crossing began around 4 p.m., an hour or so after sunset, with George Washington himself crossing in one of the first boats of troops. An advance party had been sent out, the 3rd Virginia, under the command of Captain William Washington, George Washington's second cousin, and also with Lieutenant James Monroe. More on Monroe later. This advanced unit would move ahead by boat downriver and capture any enemy troops or civilians who might spoil their cover. Once on the opposite side of the river, a secured perimeter was set up in order to contain the main army as it was coming across, and to prevent any enemy scouts from finding them. The password, in order to go between the lines, was victory or death. Meanwhile, in Trenton, Dunlop had not yet returned, so Colonel Rall was still in command of the Hessian forces. He remained so confident that the Continental Army was incapable of attack that he refused to reinforce and secure the city. And he allowed his men to fully partake in the Christmas celebrations. Though they weren't drinking, it's a common misconception that the Hessian soldiers were inebriated during the Battle of Trenton, but they weren't. Colonel Rall himself, however, was invited to the Christmas Eve celebrations of the town's Postmaster General, Abraham Hunt.
It's on this corner where I'm standing where Abraham Hunt's home once stood. Hunt, like Mr. Honeyman, was a spy for the American forces. So it's on this spot where I'm standing that Hunt entertained Rall with a fine Christmas dinner and card game, posing as a loyalist and encouraging the idea that the American forces had been defeated, all the while getting Rall good and possibly liquored up.
There was a knock on the front door, but Hunt's servants refused to let him enter. It's believed by some that the person knocking was one of the Doane Gang, a band of outlaws that at the time had been tormenting Bucks County, and they were known loyalists. They had a message for Colonel Rall that Washington and his men were crossing the river and moving south towards Trenton. They had seen it with their own eyes. But his servant refused to let him enter. Instead, the man scribbled it down as a note on a piece of paper and handed it to the servant to deliver to Rall, which he did. But Rall didn't look at it, and instead just slid it right into his pocket. Now, Abraham Hunt was actually a patriot who was intentionally distracting Colonel Rall while the crossing was happening. But the fact that the servant delivered the warning to Rall and it was Rall himself who chose not to look at it makes me think that the servant was not in on the distraction. Back and forth the Durham boats and flat-top rafts went, shuttling the 2,400 men and their cannons across the icy river, with the Marbleheaders and the Hunterdon militia at the oars. It was with great difficulty that the army got across. For the most part, the crossing went without mishap. By 3 a.m., the last of Washington's forces had made it across. By 4 a.m., the formation had begun marching southward. They would link up with the rest of the armies crossing the river once they reached Trenton, hopefully around the same time that Ewing's men would cross and take the bridge south of the city. But that's where things continued to turn against Washington. The detachment of the army that was supposed to cross at Trenton and capture the bridge across the Assunpink Creek and thereby blocking the Hessians' retreat to the south was completely blocked by ice flow in the river. Ewing, their commander, simply called off the crossing. Farther south at Bristol, the ice was also too thick to get across, so Cadwalader and his men had to move even farther south to what is today Neshaminy State Park, where they were finally able to get the army across with the intentions of attacking von Donop and preventing him from returning to Trenton to reinforce Rall. But in a last-minute failure, they couldn't get the artillery across to support the army. So Cadwalader simply aborted the mission, saying, "Never mind, we're going back," and returned his men to Pennsylvania. Washington's portion of the army was completely alone, marching on the garrisons at Trenton. Washington's men crossed the heavily forested Jacobs Creek, heading down the hillside and wading across the stream. Once they reached the town of Birmingham, the column of soldiers split into two groups in order to create a pincer attack on Trenton. The bulk of them under Washington followed along Pennington Road to the east, while another force under Major General Sullivan followed along Bear Tavern Road. Washington's army, now divided into two smaller groups and marching south through snowdrifts of up to 4 feet deep in some spots, was completely alone. He should have had 5,000 or 6,000 men now marching on Trenton, but the failures of the other two crossings reduced his numbers down to 2,400. They marched in silence, ready for the Battle of Trenton. This was the last chance the United States had at a future. The army would disband if this failed, and Congress would likely seek peace with Britain, a peace that Britain would be more than happy to grant the colonies if they returned to their dominion, which they would have to. While I readily admit that we had much better weather during our reenactment of the crossing and the march, and we didn't have to move through snow, in 1776, it was blistering cold. The world was in a mini ice age at the time. The river had been blocked up by ice, which rarely happens, and snow was pouring down. The march was grueling. So many men lacked proper boots or winter gear, but their determination to reach Trenton by dawn pushed them onward.
On to Trenton! Victory or death!
It was now sunrise. The cover of darkness was gone as Washington's men approached the town. The first engagement took place on Pennington Road, a mile north of Trenton. Washington's detachment of the army came across a large Hessian outpost. The commander of the outpost was a Hessian named Andreas Wiederholt, who stepped out of the building and onto the street, unaware of the approaching enemy. The Americans opened fire, startling Wiederholt, who shouted out, "Der Feind," which is German for the enemy.
Come on, raus! Der Feind is here!
And the Hessians returned fire. Washington rode out on horseback in front of his men, leading the charge into battle. The Hessians immediately began to retreat, falling back towards Trenton with the Americans in pursuit. As the Hessian line closed back to the city, additional troops came in to aid, firing on the advancing Americans. As the line fell back, it gave the perfect opportunity for Washington's troops to block off the road north, essentially cutting off the Hessian troops from the main British armies in that direction, preventing their possible retreat back towards them. Escape to the south, however, was still possible over the Assunpink Bridge. Ewing and his men were supposed to have captured it, but their failure to cross the river meant that escape was wide open. Dozens of Hessians, as well as around 20 or so British dragoons who were also stationed in Trenton, raced across the bridge or swam across the creek in order to escape the assault. That's when Sullivan's detachment of Washington's army showed up. They had taken Bear Tavern Road. They rushed the bridge and captured it. Fire! With no possible escape from Trenton, the Hessians attempted to organize their defenses, bringing out 2 cannons and firing on the advancing Continental Army. Despite getting off 3 cannon shots each, the Continentals pushed on it, taking out the cannon crews and turning the guns around to now fire on the Hessians.
Come on, lads! Give them fire, lads!
Washington, on horseback, moved to a hilltop to overlook the fighting from a clearer vantage point. Meanwhile, Ewing's artillery, which had failed to get across the river at Trenton, had gotten into the perfect position to open fire on the town from the far side of the river.
Prepare to give fire!
Fired across the Delaware, ripping into the Hessian formations as the unified force of Continentals pushed farther into the town. Hessians rushed out of the old French and Indian War barracks, attempting to get into formation to repel the attackers, but they could never fully organize. The Hessians retreated to a field just outside of the town where they attempted to regroup once more into a formation and strike the thinnest part of the American forces. Their main goal was just to punch through the Continentals in order to escape. They weren't even trying to win at this point, they just wanted to get away. However, the Continentals had closed in, taking up positions on the narrow streets and in several of the buildings, opening fire from well-covered positions. The Hessians were wide open in the field. They did manage to recapture some ground and 2 of the cannons, but this didn't last long. They were surrounded entirely, even with armed civilians aiding the Americans, and the last order among the Hessians was broken. The Hessian soldiers scattered to a nearby farm, but their escape had been cut off. With that, they surrendered. Colonel Rall had been hit during the fighting and lay dying in the field where his men attempted to regroup. He relinquished his sword as a formal surrender to General Washington before being taken back to his quarters in the home of Stacy Potts, where he was put in bed, and as he was dying, he was said to have finally taken the note out of his pocket that was given to him the night before and read that an attack was coming. Washington visited Rall as he lay in his bed. Rall had one request of his enemy, that his men, now prisoners, be treated with humanity. They were. In fact, many of them ended up staying in America after the war. Washington respectfully departed, and Rall passed away the day after the battle.
It's said that Colonel Johann Rall is buried somewhere in an unmarked grave here in the cemetery attached to the First Presbyterian Church on East Street. Now, this is the First Presbyterian Church behind me. It's not the original building. This is a replacement structure. However, it does share the same footprint. And I'm walking through these headstones here, and there is no marker for Rall, but there are quite a number that date back to the 1770s and even before that.
All 4 commanders of the Hessian forces present that day were killed during the Battle of Trenton. The Hessian casualties were massive. 23 were killed, including all 4 commanders. 80 were wounded, and nearly 900 were taken prisoner. The American casualties were minimal. 2 had died during the freezing cold march, as I had previously said, but none were lost during the battle. 5 men were wounded, at least 1 seriously. It was Lieutenant Monroe who crossed over the river in the advance party under Captain William Washington. Mr. Monroe was a young 18-year-old man, and his artery was severed. He did manage to recover and return to action, being promoted to captain. Mr. James Monroe would later become America's 5th president. General Washington, of course, would later become America's 1st, which means that 2 future American presidents were in this battle. The Continental Army now held Trenton, where it was able to resupply on ammunition, muskets, cannon, and clothing. Washington had initially hoped to push his army on to Princeton and engage with the British forces positioned there. However, the failures of more than half of his army to cross at the other 2 ferry points meant that he didn't have the strength to do so, and he decided to quit while he was ahead. While in Trenton, many of the Continental soldiers broke into liquor supplies. As I previously mentioned, it's often been said that the Hessian soldiers were too inebriated to fight. While Rall may have been suffering from a hangover, his troops most likely were completely sober. Therefore, there was still plenty of liquor to go around once the Continental forces arrived, and many of them helped themselves. Since Washington no longer planned to press on to Princeton, he decided to temporarily return his army back to Pennsylvania via McConkey's Ferry once more. The inebriated state of much of the Continental Army made the return trip difficult, and many soldiers ended up falling into the river, needing to be fished out. By that night, the entire force of the Continental Army was back on the Pennsylvania side of the river, with 900 prisoners in their care to be sent out to the city of Philadelphia and Lancaster County. Morale was at an all-time high, and most of the men ended up re-enlisting with the new year. The American forces were so confident in their victory that they felt that if they were able to reorganize their full army of 6,000 and cross again, they would be able to push the British and the Hessian forces completely out of that portion of New Jersey. And they were right. In early January, Washington's men re-entered New Jersey in full force, and they repelled several assaults from Lord Cornwallis's own men, British regulars. And they then achieved yet another significant victory at the Battle of Princeton to the north. After that, the Continental Army ultimately ended up entering winter quarters in New Jersey. This was a turning point for George Washington and the Continental Army. Although the war was far from over, the Battle of Trenton forced the British to rethink their strategies and rekindled the hopes of the American patriots. Anyone who knows anything about the Revolutionary War will have seen this famous painting of George Washington standing proud in a rowboat as the boat makes its way across the Danube River, and it's a painting that is now as iconic as the event itself. Wait, did I say Danube? Well, that might be because the painter, Emanuel Leutze, lived in Germany, and he set his interpretation of George Washington's crossing the Delaware against the Danube River, or Donau, in Germany. Despite this and a few other inaccuracies, this painting is virtually synonymous with the actual crossing, and was even adapted to be the back of the New Jersey State Quarter in 1999. Only an hour outside of Philadelphia, at Washington Crossing Historic Park in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, a large visitor center stands that houses an auditorium, a gift shop, and a museum. In the summer, the grounds are beautiful for hikers, picnickers, and tourists, featuring reenactments and living history events every week. In the winter, the park hosts the world-famous reenactment of George Washington's Christmas crossing. Visitors from around the world come to the park to see the show and remember the history that occurred on that cold night in 1776.
I heard through some friends that we should do this, that it was kind of like the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, like you at least have to do it once.
We're from the Midwest, so we don't have much Revolutionary War history, obviously,
None.
so yeah.
But we're actually up from DC, and we thought it would be something fun to do on Christmas Day.
The reenactment often draws thousands of people, as hundreds of reenactors stand on guard during a performance by actors portraying Washington and his officers. I shot most of this footage when I volunteered with the park around 2010, and both then and now, Washington is played by a man named John Godziba, who really fits the part. The dramatic conversation is followed by the reenactors marching down to the riverfront and boarding replica Durham boats. The park has 5 replica Durham boats that they keep in their boat barn on the park property. They're the right size and made with the same type of wood.
Feel the decking.
It's still sticky, isn't it?
Yeah, it always is. It's really a neat thing, so it's not slippery. At first I thought it was supposed to dry, but it's an 18th century mix. Really is nice.
As with all wooden boats, they need regular maintenance. Volunteers put countless hours a year into keeping these boats in ship shape so that they're ready to hit the water every December.
Oh my goodness, how many hours we put into these? Over 50 probably? Close to 50? Each? Yeah.
It isn't easy to navigate the boats across the river. These boats are faithful recreations, still operated 100% by rowers, with no motors on board, and need to be maneuvered just the same as their original counterparts. However, if the water in the river is too high or too low, the crossing needs to be called off for safety reasons.
You know, they sure would have saved themselves a lot of trouble if they just took the bridge across.
Now, I was joking when I said that, but that's actually a surprisingly common question that's asked of reenactors here. Of course, there was no bridge at McConkey's Ferry or anywhere else across the Delaware River this far south at the time. The first bridge built on this site was a covered bridge built in 1831, but it was destroyed by a flood 10 years later. Another was built and torn away in 1903. The span that you see today was built in 1904 and is still in use. At 121 years old, there are talks of soon replacing it.
There are many old buildings in this part of the historic park, but none of them were around in 1776. Not even the big stone building that is often claimed to be the McConkey's Ferry House. All of the buildings that you see on the park, although most of them are quite old, were built after the war.
The park is an important part of the local community and a strong tourist draw in this part of the country, but it means something more to the men and women who are actively involved in the park's operations.
I've been doing the crossing here. 2013 will be my 46th year doing the crossing. I'll be 81 in October. I love coming to the park. I think that one of the best things that ever happened to me was being involved.
You know, there's a certain blessing to be here at this point in time, because you can really make a difference. I'm learning something myself, not only about boats, but about history. I've lived in Bucks County my whole life, and I never realized really what went on here until I got involved. In fact, it's a little bit of time and money. Boy, I'm more than willing to be able to say I'm lucky to be at this point in time.
Just over the bridge on the New Jersey side is Washington Crossing State Park, a separate entity from the historic park on the Pennsylvania side, and a great place to hike in the summer. George Washington's crossing of the Delaware has become an iconic moment in American history, an event that nearly everyone has heard of. And now hopefully this video has helped to give you further context into the event and a better understanding of the significance of that moment. This video was a bit different for my channel, but if you enjoyed it, let me know, and I'll try to do more videos like this. My love of history is more than maritime and exploration like you usually see in my videos, but as long as we can get to the locations and film them, I'm more than happy to dive into subjects like battles or any other event. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and share the video around. Be sure to also visit my Patreon at the link below or consider signing up for my YouTube channel memberships. A special thank you to my supporters on Patreon, especially Marlo Perez, Kelly Black, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Friedrich III, Zach Richards, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Glenn Biddiscombe, Stephen Schwankerts, Gabriel Colomb, RGB, Tara Mulikar, Keith Holland, Rob M., Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Nicholas Masella, Cole Tannick, Sophie Baber, Rob, Oliver Chin-Chen, John Maluski, David Watipka, Tiffany Raridan, Mad Time Media, Nathan Gutierrez, Max Metcalf, David Littlejohn, Sean Sahi Fraser, Nikki Chan 92, Corbin McDonald, Matthew Burns, Goblin of the Salt Plains, Luke Stevens, Gordon Robbins, Aaron Stark, Troy Wentworth, Clarkey, Sam Forker, Busy Bee, Christopher Rosendale, Road Weary, Kitty Bits, Taniel 38, Kenzo Buick, Brian Reedy, Eden Cleefish, Bless Moles, Coda Yoda 16, Carol Adams, Clay Hobbs, Steve Valley, Gojira's Trains, J.C. Hobbs, High Treason, The Peppermilk, Tristan White, Jason Stray, Chance Hudson, Robert Mayer III, Jordan Page, The Handler, Georgia Tsifa, and Drew Shelton.